We've mentioned the Western Schism briefly a couple of times already on this channel, but it genuinely deserves its own full episode because at its worst point, this wasn't just two rival popes disagreeing from a distance. For a period of several years, there were three separate men simultaneously claiming to be the legitimate pope, each backed by different European kingdoms, different cardinals, and different theological arguments about legitimacy. It's one of the strangest, most genuinely destabilizing periods in the entire history of the Catholic Church, and it took an extraordinary, unprecedented kind of church council to finally resolve it. Let's walk through exactly how it happened. Welcome to Pope Pulse. This continues our deep dive into Catholic Church history. If you saw our video on the Avignon papacy, you already know how this crisis got started. This video picks up right where that one left off. As we covered in our previous video, the papacy relocated to Avignon in southern France for 67 years, finally returning to Rome in 1377 under Pope Gregory XI. Gregory died just a year later in 1378, and the conclave that followed elected an Italian archbishop, Bartolomeo Prignano, who took the name Urban VI. Urban quickly proved to be a genuinely difficult, harsh leader, alienating many of the same cardinals who had just elected him, reportedly through increasingly erratic and confrontational behavior toward the College of Cardinals almost immediately after his election. A group of primarily French cardinals, deeply unhappy with Urban and facing what they argued were serious irregularities in how his election had been conducted under pressure from a threatening crowd in Rome, declared his election invalid entirely. This same group of cardinals then held their own separate conclave and elected a different man, Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII, establishing his court back in Avignon, the very city the papacy had just left the year before. Both men now claimed to be the legitimate pope simultaneously, backed by genuinely competing legal and theological arguments about which election had actually been valid, and neither side was willing to back down. What followed wasn't simply a theological dispute confined to church officials. It became a genuinely significant geopolitical divide, with major European kingdoms choosing which papal claimant to formally recognize based heavily on their own existing political alliances and rivalries. France, unsurprisingly given the composition of the cardinals who'd elected him, backed the Avignon-based Clement VII. England, largely as a consequence of its ongoing rivalry with France during the same period, which historians now generally refer to as part of the broader Hundred Years' War, backed the Rome-based Urban VI instead. Various other kingdoms and regions across Europe similarly split their allegiance along lines that often reflected existing political relationships and rivalries considerably more than any genuinely independent theological assessment of which election had actually been more legitimate. This meant ordinary Catholics across Europe, and the clergy serving them, found themselves divided by geography and political allegiance into recognizing entirely different men as the one true pope, a genuinely destabilizing situation for an institution whose core claim to authority rested specifically on the idea of a single, unbroken, universally recognized line of leadership. Each rival pope maintained his own parallel college of cardinals, his own parallel Vatican-style administrative bureaucracy, and continued the practice of naming new cardinals specifically loyal to his own claim, ensuring the split would persist and even deepen with each successive death and replacement on either side. By the early 15th century, a growing number of cardinals and theologians from both sides had become genuinely exhausted by the ongoing split and began actively searching for some way to resolve it. In 1409, a group of cardinals from both the Roman and Avignon lines convened a council at Pisa specifically intended to resolve the crisis once and for all. This council, however, produced a result that, in hindsight, made the overall situation considerably worse rather than better, at least in the short term. Rather than persuading either existing claimant to step down, the Council of Pisa instead declared both existing claims invalid and elected an entirely new pope of its own, Alexander V, who was shortly succeeded after his own death by John XXIII. The problem was that neither of the two original claimants actually recognized the Council of Pisa's authority to depose them in the first place, meaning both continued to insist on their own legitimacy regardless. The practical result was that, for a period of several years following 1409, there were now three separate men simultaneously claiming to be the legitimate pope, each still backed by their own respective supporters across different regions of Europe, an outcome considerably messier than the two-claimant situation the Council of Pisa had originally been convened specifically to resolve. Resolving a three-way split required a considerably more ambitious and more broadly authoritative gathering than the Council of Pisa had managed to achieve. In 1414, a genuinely massive church council convened in the German city of Constance, drawing participation from representatives across virtually the entire spectrum of European political and religious authority, specifically to finally settle the crisis once and for all. The Council of Constance approached the problem with considerably more determination and broader political backing than the earlier Pisa Council had managed. Over the course of several years of negotiation, the Council secured the voluntary resignation of the Pisan-line Pope, John XXIII, and separately convinced the Roman-line Pope, Gregory XII, to also resign voluntarily, specifically framing his resignation as a necessary personal sacrifice for the sake of restoring church unity. We actually mentioned Gregory XII's resignation briefly in an earlier video in our conclave series. When we covered the history of popes who chose to resign, this council is the specific context that resignation belongs to. The remaining Avignon line claimant, Benedict XIII by that point, refused to resign under any circumstances and was formally deposed by the council instead, continuing to insist on his own legitimacy from a small, dwindling group of remaining supporters until his death years later, with virtually no remaining broader recognition across the rest of Europe by that point. With all three competing claims finally cleared away through this combination of voluntary resignation and formal deposition, the Council of Constance proceeded to elect a single new pope, Martin V, in 1417, universally recognized this time across essentially the entire Catholic world, finally ending nearly 4 decades of division. It's worth pausing on just how genuinely dangerous this entire episode was for the Catholic Church's broader credibility and institutional stability, beyond simply being an awkward, embarrassing chapter in its history. The Western Schism raised a deeply uncomfortable theological question that had never really needed serious consideration before at this scale. If the Church's core claim to authority rested on a single, unbroken line of legitimate popes, what did it actually mean when reasonable, faithful Catholics across different regions genuinely disagreed, in good faith, about which specific man currently held that position? For several decades, there was no clean, universally agreed-upon answer, and ordinary religious practice, sacraments, and church governance across large parts of Europe were directly affected by this fundamental uncertainty at the very top of the institution. The eventual resolution through the Council of Constance also raised, and left only partially settled, an important structural question that would resurface repeatedly in later church history. Does ultimate authority within the Church rest with the Pope himself, or can a sufficiently large, broadly representative council of the wider Church actually override or even depose a sitting pope under sufficiently extreme circumstances? This question, sometimes referred to by historians as conciliarism, wouldn't be fully and definitively resolved for centuries afterward, and echoes of this exact tension can still be traced through later church history and later church councils. This crisis directly shaped several of the safeguards we've discussed extensively in our earlier conclave series covering how popes are elected today. The intense focus on election legitimacy, on clear, unambiguous procedural rules for conclaves, and on preventing exactly the kind of disputed, contested election that triggered this entire crisis in the first place, all trace at least partly back to the Church's hard-earned lessons from this specific, genuinely destabilizing period. The eventual 2/3 majority requirement for papal elections, the increasingly formalized sequestration rules, and the general emphasis on procedural clarity that we've covered throughout our earlier conclave videos all reflect, at least in part, an institutional memory of exactly how badly things can go wrong when an election's legitimacy becomes genuinely, seriously contested by a significant portion of the Church itself, rather than smoothly and universally accepted from the outset. So that's the full story of the Western Schism. A crisis that began with one difficult pope and a group of frustrated cardinals, escalated into a continent-wide political and religious divide, briefly produced a genuinely bizarre three-way split, and was finally resolved only through an unprecedented, massive church council willing to depose and pressure multiple claimants simultaneously in the name of restoring unity. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Catholic Church history, subscribe to Pope Pulse for more, and let me know in the comments of everything we've covered in this series so far. Does this crisis strike you as the messiest chapter in papal history, or is there another one you think tops it?